past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. Opened the earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into laws, prisons, and courts.
Greetings, and as always, welcome back. According to the Financial Times, the Federal Reserve has signaled that it could hold interest rates steady at least through September as it defies Donald Trump's repeated calls for the central bank to dramatically lower borrowing costs. What does this latest debate over interest rates signal, and are tariffs and or their threat impacting consumer and Wall Street confidence, which could be contributing to inflation? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly take a look at a couple of today's headlines. The Times of Israel reports, Israel said to warn Hamas it will annex parts of Gaza if no hostage deal is reached. Wyckoff, the U.S. representative to the region, is there amid U.S. concerns over Gaza aid crisis and reportedly may enter Gaza to visit GHF aid sites. Netanyahu meeting top aides to discuss Gaza talks. Hey, folks, I've got an idea. Stop starving children. Stop the war crime of collective punishment. The long-term impacts on the health of future generations of Palestinian children who are starved, especially during the first 5 years of development, is inhumane, a war crime, and will have lifelong impacts as these children grow if they do survive. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says no one in Gaza is starving. He says there is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. Okay, no policy of starvation? Well, we know that's a lie, but then here would be the rebuttal. What's the policy to eliminate the starvation that's playing itself out right before our very eyes? Here's one quickly. Trump puts trade deal in doubt after Canada backs Palestinian state. Trump says it would be very hard to reach a deal with Canada after Canada said it plans to recognize a Palestinian state in September. Folks, this is one indicator that clarifies to me all of this chatter about a rift or daylight developing or appearing between Netanyahu and Trump. This is why that's BS. On the issue of starvation in Gaza, all Trump did was state the obvious. Kids in Gaza, people in Gaza are starving. That's now not debatable. So Trump's admitting the obvious, that's rhetoric. That's a change in rhetoric. That's not a change in policy. But Trump saying that it'll be very hard to reach a deal with Canada after Canada says it plans to recognize a Palestinian state, along with France and Spain and about 4 or 5 other countries in September, that's a policy issue. Now, I realize that the Zionist government in Gaza, or the Zionist government in occupied Palestine, doesn't tolerate any deviation in policy, in rhetoric, in narrative. They don't tolerate any deviation. So for Trump to state the obvious, oh, kids are starving, they can't even tolerate that. But again, that's just a change in verbiage, not a change in policy. The Financial Times reports U.S. canceled military aid talks with Taiwan. Trump administration officials worried defense minister's June visit would have undermined trade negotiations with Beijing. Now, I find this to be very telling. The U.S. canceled a meeting with Taiwan's defense minister in June, deepening concerns in Taipei that Trump is wary of supporting the country in ways that could anger China. Wellington Koo had planned to visit Washington for defense talks with Eldridge Colby, the number 3 official at the Pentagon. But the U.S. called off the meeting at the last minute, and according to several people familiar with the matter, the U.S. told Taiwan that the timing was bad because of its strikes on Iran. But several of the other people said there were other concerns. Some U.S. officials worried that allowing the Taiwanese defense minister's visit would undermine U.S.-China trade negotiations and damage Trump's efforts to secure a summit with President Xi Jinping. So after all of this rhetoric, after all of this saber-rattling and jingoistic rhetoric over Taiwan, all this anti-China gibberish, now you're starting to understand what might really be important to the United States. And finally, Brown University makes a deal with the White House to restore funding. The deal, which will require Brown, to another Ivy League institution that is capitulating to threats by the Trump administration, Brown will spend $50 million, and this comes after 2 other schools negotiated with the Trump administration to restore millions in cash. The agreement, a copy of which Brown made public, calls for the university to spend $50 million in payments to state workforce development programs over a decade and requires Brown to comply with the Trump administration's vision on matters such as transgender athletes and merit-based admission policies. Folks, fascists and authoritarians, or would-be authoritarians, are only too aware that universities are primary sites of critique and dissent. This has nothing to do with DEI. This has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. This is Donald Trump, a fascist, or at a minimum, an authoritarian, being threatened by critique and dissent from academia. That's what this is about. All right. So on today's episode, the issue before us is a tariff is a tax, and that tax gets passed straight to you, the consumer. Folks, let's stop playing games. Even if the mainstream won't focus on this, it's pretty simple. When a tariff hits, your bills go up. That math isn't that hard to do. Your bills go up. Your food costs more, your gas costs more, your wine from France costs more, your beer from Belgium costs more, your coffee costs more. What's going on with these on-again, off-again trade and tariff discussions? My guest holds a PhD in political economy. He taught economics at St. Mary's College in Moraga, California. He's the author and producer of various nonfiction and fiction works, including The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump, and his new book, Twilight of American Imperialism, comes out later this year. Dr. Jack Rasmus. Dr. Jack, as always, welcome.
Well, I hope you can hear me.
Can we hear you just fine. We'd love to see you. We'd love to see you, but we'll take your voice. We'll take.
I don't know what's going on with the damn camera, but I've tried to adjust it, but for some reason it's not accepting it. So maybe we can just do it.
We'll just do this as we have to. Your voice is what we need.
Okay, I can see and hear you fine, but I don't know what's happening with this new Logitech camera. Sorry.
Okay. Not a problem. So, Jack, but before we get to this tariff discussion, I want to get your quick explanation. The Fed holds rates steady, but two officials backed a cut. Christopher Waller and Michelle Bowman, both Trump appointees, voted yesterday against the central bank's decision to leave interest rates unchanged. And what's important, I think, for people to really understand that it's the first meeting since 2020 where more than one official voted against Powell, and the first since 93 in which more than one board governor dissented. Usually the Fed expresses their policies unanimously. This is the first time since 93 where more than one board governor dissented. Dr. Jack Rasmus.
Yeah, well, the reason for that is Trump is trying his best. Well, he's got a strategy going to pump up, to boost his view on the Fed. He wants the Fed to lower interest rates to help the economy, because the economy is not in as good shape as people say, and he knows that. And he's trying to get Powell to lower rates, and Powell is not really responding because Powell thinks correctly that inflation is still a force, which it is. So Trump is trying to get Powell out of there. And some of the governors, they know which way the wind is beginning to blow again, and they're differing with Powell here, Chair Powell, Jerome Powell of the Fed. And they're going in the other direction. And of course, they are Trump appointees. You got to remember, when in Trump's first term, he browbeat Powell before to lower rates when he came into office. And Powell was trying to raise rates for other reasons. And he succeeded. Trump succeeded. He intimidated Powell, and Powell again then lowered rates. Well, Trump's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to get Powell to lower interest rates because the economy is not doing that well, and in the future it won't do as well. You see the board governors who are playing politics. The two who have broken ranks with the Fed chair. Usually it's a unanimous thing, as you say, by the Fed board and the chair. But this is a break in that unanimous Fed governor's support of their chair here. And it reflects the growing pressure on Powell to lower interest rates. That's what's going on here.
And Jack, we've been talking for a very long time about the R word, recession. And we keep, over the years, over the last, let's say 3 years, looming recession. Where are we in that? And is that what Powell is trying to head off by keeping the interest rates where they are?
No, Powell is reflecting the inflation, which is higher than they're actually reporting. He knows that, and he doesn't want to lower interest rates because of inflation is still a force, and there's this possibility that prices will rise even more because of Trump's tariff policies. They will. They're just being implemented now, so the price impact is going to still hit. Inflation is significantly higher than what they're even reporting. We can talk about that. And because it is higher than they're reporting, GDP, the economy, is actually lower than they're reporting. You see, what is GDP, gross domestic product? It's the total goods and services produced and sold in a given year or quarter. Okay, so you get this what's called nominal GDP, which reflects inflation, and you want to adjust out the inflation to get the real growth of the economy, what they call real GDP, and that's what's reported in the media and by the government, real GDP adjusted for inflation. But if your inflation adjustment is lowballed, which it is, I've been talking about this for years, if it's lowballed, then your real GDP is going to appear higher than it actually is. Now, the government, the Fed says, real inflation is like 2.5%, which is nonsense. That's the PCE, personal consumption expenditure price indicator. If it's lowballed, which it is, and we can talk about the reasons, then GDP is actually higher than it is. And that's what's going on right now. We got these numbers for GDP just come out here. And the economy is really lower. It's not doing as well as they're saying because you got a lowballed inflation adjustment. If you adjusted prices according to the consumer price index, which is another indicator of inflation. See, the government uses the PCE, which is a different inflation index, which is lowballed. Even the CPI is lowballed, but not as badly. But if you use CPI, then the economy would not be growing at a 3% annual rate that just came out, right, for the second quarter. It would be growing maybe 1%. And even that 1%, you got to remember, is over adjusted because of inventories, right? And trade, net exports, trade. We had a zero contracted GDP in the first quarter. Why? Because of this category in GDP called net exports, which is the difference between imports and exports. And that's always been a negative number for the U.S. because we always import more than we export. And that negative number always subtracts from the other forces that show a growth in GDP. Well, what happened in the first quarter was imports almost disappeared, right? Because of the trade war, right? Which got everybody scared in the first quarter. So imports almost stopped. And because they did, the negative contribution of imports to GDP abated. But now in the second quarter, we've got these Trump tariffs, which look like no big trade war. They're all coming in 10 to 15%, right? So you got another increase in imports or increase in exports. So net exports, which cause a negative impact on GDP in the first quarter is now showing a positive impact on GDP. It's all about net exports because of the trade war. So you can't really count as an accurate growth what went on in the first quarter, nor can you count this 3% annual GDP in the second quarter. GDP is not really showing you what's going on in the economy, is what I'm saying.
Got it. So again, as we've been talking again for a couple of years about a looming recession, and even though they've played with the data and they've played with the definition about what is actually a recession, what are you seeing with this big looming trade war issue? What are your projections, let's say, for the next quarter as it relates to recession?
Yeah. Well, I think all this trade war is beginning to show it's a big nothing. He comes out as soon as he gets to the office. I'm talking about Trump. He comes out with these tremendous increases. He wanted 150% increase on everything from China, right? All the imports from China. Well, China said, okay, and we're not going to give you any rare earths either that you need for your auto industry and your tech industry. So it just froze up. And oh, wow, Trump says we can't have this because Walmart and all the auto companies were calling him up saying, hey, you can't have a trade war with China because China's calling your bluff and they're not exporting anything that we need. So he backed off of that.
Mm-hmm.
He announced a truce in the trade war with China, and now they're quietly negotiating. They restored the rest of the rare earths and so forth, and they suspended it all, right, while they're negotiating. And if you look at the other negotiations everywhere else with Japan and Europe, they just solved. What are the tariffs? They're like 10 to 15% tariffs. That's it. Well, that's no big deal. I mean, the global economy in these countries will absorb that. So all this talk about a trade war upsetting the economy, I think, is a lot of hype by the mainstream media. It's not going to happen because he's going to settle for minimum tariffs, about 10%. And that's all he really wants anyway, because the whole idea of this tariff thing going on with Trump is to raise revenues. That's all. He wants to raise revenues from tariffs and to use those revenues to finance new U.S. weapons development. You see, this is just moving the money around. He's going to use tariffs to fund, the expansion of the U.S. military, and especially in these areas that the U.S. is now way behind China and Russia, in drones and in hypersonic missiles. And he wants to build up the position in the Navy. We're not building ships and so forth. So he's really moving the money around. And the whole idea of tariffs are twofold. One, tariffs is to raise revenue, and he is satisfied with a 10-15%, right? And the other is to intimidate other countries politically, to make political changes. You see, we've weaponized the tariffs to force other countries to make changes in their immigration policy, or in so-called drug imports to the U.S., or in the case of Brazil, right? He doesn't like what Brazil's doing to his old buddy Bolsonaro down there, so he's saying 50% tariffs on you, right? Or he doesn't like the fact that Russia is not responding to a ceasefire and capitulating, so he's saying, 100% tariffs on you. Or he doesn't like the fact that the BRICS countries, aren't going along with what he wants, so he says, 15% on you or 20% on China. This is politicizing tariffs because the sanctions aren't working. The tariff war is really politicizing an extension of the sanctions war. So you got to understand that there's different objectives with the tariffs, and they aren't as serious as he implied when he came into office.
So that whole adage, or that I'm drawing a blank on the word, acronym. There we go. TACO. Trump always chickens out. And, you know, he reminds me of that barking dog in the yard. You know, whenever you come across a barking dog, you've got to check two things. One, is the dog coming forward, or is the dog backing up? And the other one is the tail wagging, or is the tail between the legs? Trump he's in the yard barking, but he just keeps backing up.
Yeah, well, you got to understand who's pulling his tail, right?
Okay, go ahead.
He makes these changes because he gets calls from Walmart, he gets calls from the auto companies, he gets calls from all these big donors and capitalists that fund him, or he gets calls from Israel, right, and the Mossad or whatever, and he responds. That's why he looks like he's flip-flopping. He comes out with all these grandiose positions and everything, big bombast, right? And then he backs up rapidly. Well, he backs up because people called him and say, hey, Donald, you can't do this. You know, we're not getting any rare earths from China. We can't produce our cars or our computers or our data centers. You know, you better stop. Okay, we'll stop, right? Or the same thing is happening on the political side from the Zionists putting pressure on him, or the neocons in the deep state putting pressure on him, and he flip-flops. And this is what the guy is. He's full of bombast. He's full of these dramatic moves, to make himself look good. And then he lies like hell when he backs up.
Right.
You know, a good example of the latest lie is he said, the Europeans, as part of this trade deal, are going to invest $600 billion in the U.S. economy. Right. Well, the European says, no, we only said maybe 200 billion. And then you got, the Japanese are going to invest 500 billion in new investments in the U.S. economy. Hey, that's all smoke and mirrors. Those countries are not going to deliver on that, but it makes him look good that he's, making these countries invest in the U.S. And the same thing with U.S. multinational corporations that moved offshore. They said they're going to invest 500 billion in you. This is all talk. This is not going to materialize, but it makes him look good with the public that,
especially leading up to the midterms. It makes him It makes him look good leading up to the midterms. You wrote a piece on July 9th. You published it on July 9th. America's 25-year tax cutting and fiscal train wreck. Last week, the U.S. Congress passed the Trump tax cuts. Of course, again, this was from July 9. The mainstream media and economists have been mostly reporting the details of the cuts, which taxes got cut in the 2025 Act, how much accrued to business and wealthy. But you say not the most important. They purposely ignore the cuts in historical perspective and the bigger picture they represent. And the historic perspective and connecting the dots between the current and the historic is what we do on this show. How can you connect the dots between the historical perspective and the bigger picture and relate it to a lot of the things that we've been talking about on this show?
Yeah, well, since 2001, the U.S. elite of both parties have been undertaking a massive tax cut regime here. Most of the tax cuts go to businesses, right? Our corporations, our wealthy investors are the 1%, about 80%. How much have we cut taxes since 2001? $17 trillion since 2001, not counting the current tax cut, which is going to be about $5 trillion more in tax cuts. So over $22 trillion in tax cuts, mostly going to the wealthy and businesses. And I've documented it, right? Bush, $3.8 trillion during his term, another $180 billion when the 2008 crash happened. Obama comes in, cuts $300 billion. Then in 2010, he cuts another $800 billion. And then in 2013, he makes permanent the Bush tax cuts. That cost $5 trillion. And then in 2014, 17, Trump comes in, cuts $4.5 trillion, and now you got another $5 trillion in tax cuts. So it's over $20 trillion. And we also spend $9 trillion in these wars, mostly in the Middle East since 2001. So, you add 20 trillion in tax cuts, 9 trillion in wars, that's 29 trillion out of the $37 trillion national debt. Okay, so that's most of your national debt, wars and tax cuts. Then you throw in the bailouts of 2008 and 2020, and then you add $1 trillion annual interest now paid to wealthy U.S. Treasury bondholders, and there's your deficit and debt. That's it. And the question is, why now in the 21st century are the elites of both parties here cutting massive taxes and generating these deficits and debt and spending trillions on wars and trying to bail out whenever these crashes come every 10 years, right? Why are they doing this? Well, this is what I cover in my book. They're doing it to try to rescue the empire, which is in deep trouble. The U.S. empire is not collapsing. Let's get that very much clear. I disagree with some people on the left that say, oh, it's the end, it's the collapse. There's a lot of wishful thinking in that. No, but it is in trouble. And it is in decline. It's in the early stages of decline. Yes. And it's resorting to military and regime change action and sanctions and tariffs to try to maintain its status. So you got to put it in big perspective, right? And this is the problem of the 21st century. The economy cannot handle the empire. They've got to do it on debt. And they're raising this debt in order, $37 trillion national debt. By the way, that doesn't even count the $8 trillion Federal Reserve debt or the $4 trillion state and local government debt. You added up, you're way over $40 trillion. And that's why we're paying $1 trillion interest on the debt to bondholders, including foreign bondholders, who are financing the deficits in the debt.
So here's one question that I think that folks need to be asking themselves, irrespective of party, irrespective of political affiliation or political alignment or political ideology. Here's a question a very simple question that I think particularly voters need to be asking themselves. We've been told since the Reagan administration the need to cut taxes in order to stimulate the economy. They called it trickle-down economics. George H.W. called it voodoo economics because H.W. said cutting those taxes is not going to result in the 1% investing those savings into the economy, thereby stimulating the economy. That's not going to happen. So here we are in 2025. We're having to cut school budgets, and people are having to pay more. If you want your child to have art in school, you got to pay for it. If you want your child to be in the band in school, you have to pay for it. If you want your child to play football in school, you have to pay for it. Social safety net programs are being cut. We've never seen the growth in the economy that they always promise. But I don't hear folks asking their elected representatives as they're paying more for bread, as they're paying more for milk, as they're paying more for eggs. Where's the saving? Where's the investment? Where's the stimulus? I don't hear that question being asked, Dr. Jack.
Yeah, well, you got to understand these massive tax cuts. Where have they gone? They haven't gone into boosting the domestic U.S. economy. So where have all these tax cuts for businesses really gone? Well, businesses and wealthy investors take the tax cuts, and you know what they do with it? They invest in stock markets, in bond markets, not in the real economy. Or if they're multinational corporations or global investors, they take the money and they invest it offshore. The massive amount of all these tax cuts, and by the way, Federal Reserve interest rate reductions, right? Where does it go? It goes
making money cheaper.
Yeah,
making money cheaper.
Cuts, right? The tax cuts and the lower rates. Most of that savings goes into financial asset markets or offshore, right? And that's why it's not really stimulating the real economy. Look, if you look at what happened in 2008 and 9, how much did we cut taxes under Obama? Right? We cut taxes about $6 trillion because he in 2012, he made the Bush tax cuts permanent. The Bush tax cuts in 2001 were only supposed to last 10 years. Well, they expired in 2010. He extended them 2 years at $800 billion and for more tax cuts. Then he made them permanent. Obama cut taxes more than $6 trillion. And what did we get in GDP and real growth during his term? Very little. It was way below recovery rates from recession, historical rates of GDP growth, right? It was about 60% of normal, despite $6 trillion. And by the way, he cut spending on social programs. I'm talking about Obama now. By over $1 trillion in 2011. So this cut of what you see now in social programs is really a reflection, a repeat of what Obama did in 2011 after they tried to stimulate the economy with, safety net and spending, right, in 2008-9. He turns around in 2011 and takes $1 trillion back out. He cut education and health by $1 trillion back then. What is Trump doing now? Well, he's cutting it by $1.5 trillion now. It's the same thing. Doesn't matter what side of the elite you're on. After a crisis, after they throw money into the economy, they take it back out from you. And that's what they're doing right now. Here's the most telling statistic, right? In 2021, we had the COVID recession, right? How much fiscal and monetary stimulus did they throw into the economy? Over $10 trillion they threw into the economy, right? $3.1 trillion in program spending in 2020, another $1.9 trillion under Biden in 2021. So that's $5 trillion, right? In just fiscal spending. And then Biden turns around and he gives $1.7 trillion more in 2022 to businesses. 3 acts, right? The CHIP Act, the Infrastructure Act, and the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is just subsidies to energy companies. So they spend $6.7 trillion in fiscal stimulus in 2022. The Fed throws another $4 trillion in monetary stimulus. So between 20 and 2022, they spend $10.7 trillion in fiscal and monetary stimulus. And what kind of GDP real growth did we get in 23 and 24? 2.5% GDP, which is just the long-term average, 2.5%. We throw $10 trillion to get 2.5% GDP growth. It's broken. Fiscal and monetary policy are broken. Why? Because they're now being used to subsidize big capital instead of stimulating the economy. And they're having trouble stimulating the economy because of changes in capitalism in which this money flows into financial assets and offshore. That's the big problem of the 21st century. They cannot stimulate the economy anymore with fiscal and monetary traditional means because it's being used to subsidize big capital, particularly finance capital. They can't get the economy going again. And what are they doing in this 2025 bill? They're throwing more tax cuts at the rich and at the corporations. And what does Trump want to do? He wants to lower interest rates again to do the same thing. You see, there's a major contradiction in capitalism in the 21st century. The fiscal monetary policies don't work like they used to. They're using them to subsidize big capital and big corporations, and they're in trouble here with GDP. They can't get it going again, and they won't. It's the real economy is growing 1%, maybe 1%, not 3%. You see that 3% that they just said is annualized. It's really in the second quarter growing maybe 0.75%, but they take it and they annualize it. They multiply it by 4 quarters to get to 3%, right? But if you look at GDP, over half of the source of GDP in the second quarter is contracting. It's mostly all smoke and mirrors because of the tariffs reversing themselves, right? And other factors as well, and if you, as I said initially, if you really adjusted it by inflation, you'd show it's growing about 1%. So the real economy is hardly growing. And these tax cuts are not going to have a big effect, but the spending cuts will have a big effect.
Oh, a huge effect.
$1.5 trillion taken out of Medicare, and the net cuts in education spending are yet to come. He's cutting all the federal education department. He's throwing it onto the state local governments, and they're going to have to do the cutting.
See, Jack, that's a big part of my earlier question is there seems to be a huge disconnect between what the government is doing, and again, it's on both sides of the aisle, in terms of the tax cutting, the rationale that we're being sold for the tax cutting, the benefit that we keep getting promised, and it never comes. And folks don't seem to understand you can't cut your way to prosperity. The economics, tell me, am I wrong? You can't cut your budget to prosperity. It doesn't work that way.
Well, the whole argument of tax cuts create jobs, business tax cuts create jobs, is the argument. This has been going on ever since Ronald Reagan, but there's no empirical evidence that it does. Because, as I said, especially in the 21st century, that tax cuts are going into financial markets and offshore, just as the low interest rates are being borrowed to invest in by business, financial markets, and offshore. The majority of it is flowing out of the real economy in the U.S., right? But they keep saying, tax cuts create jobs. But there is no empirical evidence of that. In fact, quite to the contrary. Business tax cuts do not create jobs. Businesses hoard the tax cuts,
correct,
or they reinvest it outside of the economy. Now, there is some investment in the economy, but my point is it's declining and it's very low now.
They artificially, they take those savings, they buy back their own stock, which artificially inflates the value of the company. And then that data is used as to try to convince us that the economy is thriving. And people sit back and they look and they say, well, wait a minute. Why am I paying so much for eggs? Why am I paying so much for milk? Why is oatmeal costing me as much as it's costing me? And I'm using eggs and milk and oatmeal because, hell, if you can't afford a box of oatmeal, you are in serious, serious trouble.
Here's a statistic for your audience to keep in mind. Fortune 500 companies, the largest U.S. 500 companies, right? Between 2010 and 2018 gave their shareholders, I'm just talking about the largest 500, okay? I mean, there's tens of thousands of companies, public companies, right? Gave their shareholders in stock buybacks and dividend payments in that 10 years, $17 trillion. They gave it back, rebuying their stock, which goes to the shareholders, right? Or paying the shareholders dividends, $17 trillion. Now, you got to add more to that after 2019. What is the rate of the Fortune 500 companies and stock buybacks and dividend payments going per year? $1.5 trillion. They're giving their shareholders every year now. Just the big 500. If you looked at all of them, it'd be, it's got to be $2-3 trillion a year. Where are they getting all this money from? Profits by raising prices, right, is one. Tax cuts, right, and low interest rates. In other words, that's why you've got all this income inequality running amok. Right? The shareholders and the capitalists and the finance capitalists are getting all the money. It's being funneled to them. It's a big machine funneling all the money to them now, right? And they're not reinvesting it in the U.S. economy. And you're seeing the results. As far as inflation is concerned, I've been talking for years. As I said earlier, they're lowballing the inflation. Let me give you some examples. Let me give you some examples of inflation here, right? Oh, the Fed says inflation's only 2.5% this past year. You and I know that's nonsense, right?
That's yes.
Let's take an example of the games that they play with the inflation number, okay? How much has your insurance gone up? Your auto insurance, right? And your home insurance? Well, mine went up 25% in 1 year, both of them, 25%. Oh, but wait a minute. They're saying insurance is only going up 2-3% over the past year. Well, how did they do this? Look, they don't go to the insurance companies and say, how much do you raise your prices? You know how they estimate prices in insurance? They go to the companies and they say, well, what was your profits? And they extrapolate a price from the profit levels. They don't measure the actual price increase. They extrapolate the figure for insurance inflation from profits. And guess what the insurance companies do? They hide their profits so they don't have to pay taxes, right? There are all kinds of ways they lowball their profits. They even say, oh, we're losing money, so they don't pay anything. We know all of these companies that say, oh, we didn't pay any taxes because we had no profits, right? They're all playing games with their balance sheets. So in other words, here's an example of a huge increase going on in insurances right now, where they don't measure prices. They have another methodology. Another is rents. We know rents are going up, huh? Why are rents going up? Well, they're only going up 3%, they say, which is nonsense. Why? Because the government only looks at new rental contract price increases. Everybody who already has a rent and has their rent raised is not considered in the statistic for rent prices. I can go on and on with all these phony assumptions and methodologies that go into estimating inflation that lowballs inflation. By the way, the same thing I've talked about that goes into lowballing the unemployment rate, which is a hell of a lot. It's at least twice what they're reporting. The government, with the mainstream media, is manipulating the reports. And it's not that they're lying, they're just cherry picking and manipulating the methodologies to come up with numbers that are better than reality.
Well, that's a lie. They're manipulating. They're manipulating the data to intentionally mislead to a bad conclusion. My father would say, "Son, you're lying to me."
Yeah. Well, let's take an example of the unemployment rate. They say, "Oh, unemployment's only like 4%." That there's 165 million people in the U.S. workforce, right? There's maybe 100 million who are full-time workers. That 4% unemployment rate is only for full-time workers. Another 60 million people who are part-time, temp, gig workers or whatever aren't calculated in that 4% unemployment rate. And the government even has a statistic for them, right? Doesn't get reported in the mainstream media. But if you looked at the true 165 million people, what's the employment rate? It's double the 4%. It's double, Right? There's 8% unemployment right now, and actually even more, but I won't get into those reasons. So, they cherry pick, the mainstream media cherry picks the number to make it look good. They play ball with the government, and the government uses methodologies and assumptions questionable to lowball the inflation rate. And they can claim, oh, as a result, we've got a GDP of 3% per year, right? Which is only, as I said, because of the export tariff situation, basically, right? And the economy is growing barely at 1% a year. That's what it's growing at. And the historical average, is really 2.5%, 3%.
Brother Norm Clement, thank you so much for that $20 super sticker. Greatly appreciate that contribution. And so Jack, I want to quickly go back to this. Well, no, you know what? Let me go to this. Besant hails new Trump accounts as backdoor for privatizing Social Security. These Trump accounts, according to Besant, said it's going to make everybody a shareholder in the economy. They were originally called MAGA accounts, allowing parents to contribute up to $5,000 each year on behalf of their children. Contributions can also come from employers and charitable organizations. The funds must be invested in portfolios tied to U.S. stock indexes and are structured to similarly to individual retirement accounts. First of all, I don't see why more of these type of accounts shouldn't be allowed in conjunction with Social Security, not to offset. So, hey, particularly in this economy and the way the economy is going, the more avenues you have to save, the better off you are. So I don't, so long as these accounts aren't promoted or allowed to replace Social Security, I say the more accounts, the better. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the problem with that, though, it's the camel privatization.
Nose under the tent.
Under the tent, under the Social Security tent. And they've been trying to do this since Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton talked about, we should let people take some of their Social Security and invest it in the stock market, right? Or the government will invest it in the stock market for them. And then George Bush comes along and he tries to privatize in Social Security. In other words, taking the Clinton idea and privatizing it and saying, you should be able to invest whatever balance you have in Social Security in the stock markets. Well, if you had done that, you would have lost all your Social Security, just as people lose their 401ks, right? Every time there's a financial crash, right? They've been coming up for decades with different kind of schemes in order to pull money out of Social Security and use it. And by the way, one thing that came clear in these recent negotiations on the tax deal is that people are paying double for Social Security. You're being taxed twice, right? You're being taxed with the payroll tax, right? To take money in, put it in your Social Security account. But then, thanks to Ronald Reagan, when you start claiming Social Security, the government taxes you again. They tax your Social Security income. 50% was what Reagan did. And then, his good buddy Bill Clinton raised that to 85%. So they're taxing us twice. And they've been trying in all different ways to privatize that money. This has been, part of the whole privatization neoliberal effort in a whole number of ways ever since Ronald Reagan. And it's not stopping under Trump. Trump is coming up with all kinds of ways to privatize public wealth and personal income and personal insurances and so forth. It's just a continuation of what's going on. They destroyed pension plans. We once had great pension plans through your union and whatever, guaranteed pensions. And, they got rid of those except for the public sector, and they're trying to do that too. They got rid of those and replaced them with individual retirement accounts, IRAs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Privatized.
Right.
That's a privatization of the retirement system. Okay. And they're trying to go after Social Security to do the same. And this is just another scheme to get their nose under the tent, you see. And once they do that, and they have a channel for sucking money out of the Social Security Trust Fund and into whatever, education accounts or stock markets or whatever, they'll just open that wider and wider.
Let me, we're up against the clock. And so let me try to combine a couple of things. When we look at these trade talks, China and U.S. trade talks conclude without a deal. Trump puts trade deal in doubt after Canada backs Palestinian state. The new trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU is supposed to lift tariffs on imports of goods from EU countries to their highest level in decades. Tomorrow is the 1st of August, when Trump's huge tariff scheme is supposed to hit.
Yeah.
So what do you see happening in the month of August relative to this August 1st tariff? Where will the average American and average family feel the impact of this August 1st deadline? And folks in the chat, you tell me, where do you expect to see? And Jonathan Soul, thank you for that $9.99. So Jack, let's go to, does Genius Act allow 401ks to invest our money in volatile crypto? I don't know, Jack. You might know the answer to that question. And then looking at that again, where do we expect to see the clearest impact of tomorrow's August 1st tariff deadline?
You won't see any impact. Okay. Why? Because it's just going to be a lot of bombast announcements, right? It's just the start of negotiations, really. And this is the typical Trump procedure, right? He comes out and he whacks whoever it is with the outrageous threats. You're going to see what, 25% on India, 50% on Mexico, and whatever. But that's just the beginning of negotiations. All these negotiations, as I said earlier, will end up in net tariffs of 10 to 15%. That's the template. You saw that in Japan. You saw that in Europe, right? 10 to 15%. China is a different story. We don't know where that's ended up because China can kick back pretty hard, and they have, and they've said pretty much, we're not going to capitulate to you like Europe and Japan did. They're just your vassals, right? You can get whatever you want out of Japan and Europe. The result will be probably around 10 to 15%. That's where, but this is going to take weeks and months. So the announcements tomorrow don't mean a diddle, really, because that only means the beginning of negotiations. They'll end up 10 to 15%. The other date that you haven't mentioned is August 12th, right? August 12th is when new sanctions hit and new tariffs hit on Russia and any country doing business with Russia.
Correct.
Secondary sanctions, right? And also, that's the deadline for the China negotiations. You'll see on August 12th, big increase in sanctions, right? Tomorrow, August 1st, you'll see tariff increases. And then August 12th, you see sanctions increases, probably something similar to, what the neocons, Lindsey Graham and his buddies have proposed, secondary sanctions on Russia and whoever deals with Russia. That'll come August 12th, but that's only the beginning of the show as well. So you got to separate out what's announced and what actually happens after negotiations. And it's those happenings that will take weeks more.
And Jonathan Soul, I believe that the 401ks will be allowed to invest money in crypto, which will just be another scheme And folks that do that, some could do well, but you're really rolling the dice on that one.
Yeah, wait till the next financial crisis, and you're going to lose your shirt on crypto.
And Norm Clement, your point. Where are all these deals in writing? They're not in writing because they don't exist. And the Jamon says, we already see it. Everything is more expensive. Jack, to that point, every time I go to the grocery store, and I go there quite often, I'm scratching my head at how much I'm paying just for the basics. But how much of that is tied to tariffs versus how much of that is tied to price gouging?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on the individual product and where it's coming from, right? I mean, if you're talking about food imports from Mexico or coffee from around the world or whatever, most of that's going to be passed on to the consumer, right? But if it's something that's part of a company that's a monopoly, right, or almost a monopoly, it can absorb some of those costs themselves, right? So we don't know how much will be passed on to the consumer, and of course it all depends on whether we got a recession or not, how much gets passed on, right? So you can't say everything in the tariff 10-15% is going to end up with 10-15% in prices. Depends on the company, depends on the product, on where it's coming from, and the degree of monopoly in the industry. And no one in the government can give you a number or in the media of how much that's going to be. But you know damn well that if it's a food product from Latin America or coffee or something like that, it's going to largely pass through. You're going to be paying more for food, for coffee, and so forth. We'll just have to see how that works, but you'll see that in the fourth quarter. You're going to see a lot of these tariff negotiations concluded here in the third quarter. The big push starting in August, and then you'll start seeing some effect in the fourth quarter.
Dr. Jack Rasmus hey Jack, where do people go to access your brilliance other than this program?
Yeah, well, you can go to my blog, jackrasmus.com. I post my written articles and some of my interviews there. Or you can listen to me on my own radio show, Alternative Visions, 2 p.m. Every Friday on the Progressive Radio Network out of New York. Those are the main ways. I used to be on X, but they knocked me off of X.
Did they really?
Yeah, I want to. They knocked me off. I got a new computer and I tried to put in my my password and I got it wrong. And they said, "Oh, boy, you can't play on X anymore."
Okay.
And they knocked me off.
Well, let me say this piece. I think, folks, America's 25-year tax cutting and fiscal train wreck is a great piece to read because it's very well written. The data in it supports the argument, and what you really get to understand is that, as I say all the time, Donald Trump isn't the causation, he's the culmination. And so you see over this 25-year period, this whole tax cutting issue is not the brainchild of Donald Trump, and that both parties are complicit in the theft. Is that fair to say, Dr. Jack?
Yeah, and also you got to add all the austerity cutting.
Right.
I mean, Obama and this guy Trump. There's no difference. It's the same thing. Cut. This is neoliberalism. Cut social spending, increase defense spending, cut taxes mostly on the rich, lower interest rates. All that means you're subsidizing capitalists and big investors and corporations.
Dr. Jack Rasmus, again, really appreciate it. We worked through the main part of the technical difficulty, and we got to hear the brilliance, even though we didn't get to see the handsome face. Thanks, Jack.
My pleasure. Anytime.
All right, folks, thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. And new episode tomorrow. Laith Maroof will join us tomorrow. That one you can count on. Please follow and subscribe, leave a review, share the show. Again, we could really appreciate just the minimum. $5 a month will go a very long way in helping to keep this project afloat. And again, if you can sacrifice just one Lacamata Hada with whip and foam and extra cinnamon, if you can, one a week will go a very long way in keeping you informed, in keeping you in tune to what's happening, and will help you understand not so much the what, but help you understand the why. And remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter. And we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Laith Maroof will join us. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a wonderful, blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.